before I begin on my three main clashes, first of all, a challenge characterization coming from Wit, it's a bit late, right? Anyway, on to my three clashes. Firstly, does the need to level the playing field outweigh the need for humanitarian values in times of war? Secondly, the nature of chemical weapons. And third of all, banning versus regulating. Now on my first clash, right, assuming that their paradigm can work, and chemical weapons will only be used against the military, right? Let me show you how there's a very simple answer to why humanitarian values that IHL dictates should still be held in times of war, and by the very fact that those humanitarian values should exist, chemical warfare should not exist in the battlefield, right? There's a global abhorrence for chemical weapons, and that global abhorrence exists for a reason. The very fact is that the nature of chemical weapons is that they are indiscriminate and they're inhumane, right? In fact, they even stay in the air long enough to be transmitted to nearby civilian populations. But I'll deal with that a little bit later, right? In World War I, thousands of people in the US were scarred by mustard gas, and it also caused long-term lung problems. And this exists for a very long time, even after the war happens, right? And the very fact that chemical warfare is indiscriminate and inhumane, right, should dictate that they shouldn't be used on the war in times of war at all, because of the humanitarian values which exist that IHL states out, not really tackled by their side, right? In fact, we brought up a POI that states that IHL states, in fact, very, very clearly that soldiers should not be left to bleed on the battlefield. If, for example, a soldier gets shot in the shoulder, right, he's bleeding to death. The proper thing to do by IHL would be to go over and shoot him in the head to prevent him from any further pain. That is the kind of humanitarian values that exist even in times of war, and the kind of humanitarian values that our side continues to strive for, and therefore we should ban chemical weapons, in fact, because of the very fact that chemical weapons allows for more suffering instead of less. And this is something that we as an international platform want to avoid, right? And for there's that argument about norms shifting and that changing times we should now start allowing chemical warfare, right? That's a completely moot point, because norm shifting doesn't mean that there should be a shift in the existence of humanitarian values on the battlefield. So by that entire point, the very reason we haven't addressed it that much is because the entire point falls by the very fact that IHL exists, principles of IHL exist, and these should continue to be carried out even in the battlefield, right? And finally, like about the indiscrimination, the thing that they brought up about a line should be drawn against indiscriminate warfare, right? That line should have been drawn by them, right? And they've already considered that chemical warfare is in fact indiscriminate, so their high point comes. Anyway, moving on to the second clash. Before that, anybody? No? Okay. Anyway, second clash, right? Nature of chemical weapons. Now, they brought up this point of mutually assured destruction. Now, first of all, mutually assured destruction isn't applicable in this debate because we're arguing in the context of a war already happening, not the possibility of one. For example, the Cold War, they were hovering with their fingers over their nuclear warfare buttons because there was a possibility of war, not an actual war going on. So the example doesn't fit in this debate. But, okay, let me just address it for the sake of it, right? MAD doesn't even exist on your side because there are different levels of chemical weaponry. There's like the cheapest, which is like not that effective and not that costly, right? Which is what poor countries are going to be able to afford. Then there's toxins, gases that target the nerve system, which is expensive and requires development, right? Which richer countries are going to be able to afford, like sarin, nerve gas, right? And so this disparity always exists, even if you start allowing chemical warfare, chemical weaponry. This disparity is always going to be the same because richer countries are always going to be able to afford better chemical weapons, and poorer countries aren't going to be able to afford as good chemical weapons yet.
We already told you that on what about conventional weapons is a number game. When chemical weapons, the very fact that you have chemical weapons is a big enough deterrence to any other country that is out there.
But deterrence doesn't apply because we're already talking in terms of war. There is always going to be an escalation of violence because there's no more deterrence. They've already passed that stage, they're heading right into war. Okay? So yeah, it doesn't even make sense. Right? Okay? So anyway, either way, right, even on their side or our side, there is no equal playing field. There's never going to be an equal playing field in any kind of war. So that's completely false. Right? And even if chemical, but let's move on from that, right? The nature of chemical weapons is that they are indiscriminate and inhumane. Let me bring up two examples, okay? Each of which illustrate two different points. Vietnam. Okay, in Vietnam, the US wanted to target the rebels that were hiding in the jungles. What they wanted to do was destroy the foliage, and they used a gas called Agent Orange, which was meant, first of all, to destroy the foliage and destroy food for the rebels, right? But what eventually happened was it went into the crops that villagers ate. Villagers were affected as well. Civilians were affected. And while this may not have been intentional, while this was meant particularly for the militarized rebels, right, it still affected civilians. Now that's one example where we don't want to happen again, right? But another example about what the points that we talked about, Egypt and Yemen. Egypt gassed Yemeni civilians, hundreds of them, okay? And the thing is like, and the same way, right, like about 150,000 people died there. And it happens. The nature of chemical weapons is, right, that military bases are going to have gas masks against it. They're not going to say, oh, there's a possibility of chemical weaponry, let me not make any methods to prevent that. Let me just stand here and wait for the chemical weapons to go into my lungs. They're not going to say that. There are going to be gas masks, there's going to be preventive measures, right? And the thing is, who doesn't have these preventive measures? Civilians. And the nature of chemical warfare is that because it is useless against militarized bases and because it is useless against the military, they're going to go ahead and use it on the civilians to instill fear and chaos and all the other things that we're normally supposed to have, right? Yes?
Non-state actors, like dictators, are going to use them against civilians anyway. What is your side doing to prevent them from doing that?
Okay, the thing about non-state actors is, right, that we're banning chemical warfare, so they're not going to be able to have them, right? And if we're banning it, we're also working towards destruction of chemical warfare, and I think Annie already brought that up. In fact, since '93, destruction of 80% of all declared chemical weapons stockpiles have been verified. The destruction has been verified, okay? So we're already working towards that. So that means people non-state actors aren't really a part of the debate. Anyway, so moving on, right? In World War I, okay, chemical agents caused an estimate of 1.3 million casualties, including 9,000 deaths. And that's a kind of a situation, right, that we want to avoid. And it's a situation we can't avoid if we allow chemical weapons. And I think the very fact that the possibility of, the very real and very large possibility of harm even exists for these civilians, right, dictates that we shouldn't allow it in the first place. Now on my last class, right, banning versus regulating. Now, first of all, banning sends a message that this is the stand of the international platform. This is what we believe in. This is our moral and legal stand, and we are not going to allow chemical warfare to be ever used in any kind of situation whatsoever, right? And ineffectiveness or unenforceability of this policy or unenforceability of this law doesn't justify the repealment of these laws. It doesn't justify that these principles don't exist and that we should just give up our principles just because it's going to be done anyway. On the rationale of their side, right, it's just because it's done already, right, we shouldn't ban it at all. We should just allow it. In that case, let's just go allow drug trafficking and murder, because those things are all done anyway, right? We're not going to be able to catch every murderer or drug trafficker or drug user out there. So let's just not ban, let's just allow everything. How about that? But the thing is, when we do that, right, the issue with that is we no longer have a stand, either moral or legal, and we don't have any way of enforcing against the things that are immoral or morally wrong, right? And in our paradigm, at least we have a way of punishment. So if we do ban it, less people will do it, and we do have a legal stand. Right? So equality exists on our side because we ban everyone from doing it, and by that alone, I am very proud to oppose.